another country, a smaller country, perhaps a weaker and vulnerable country, to say something or to take some action which would allow India further grounds for coercion. So yes, lower official rhetoric on both sides. Effective ceasefire on the LOC. Yes, Pakistan was the one country which initiated the ceasefire in 2003. Pakistan will be ready to continue that ceasefire at any time. Perhaps India can be persuaded to also make a similar affirmation. 4. Mumbai and Pathankot. These are two issues on which the two countries have tried to cooperate with each other. But unfortunately, both sides accuse the other of not providing sufficient evidence or not being cooperative enough. On Mumbai, the case is in the courts, and our courts demand certain evidence which is not forthcoming. On Pathankot, the Indian team has so far not been able to visit Pakistan, and certainly we hope that when the situation between the two countries cools down, an Indian team can visit in the context of the Pathankot incident. Better governance to control India, to control violence in IOK. This is a suggestion, I suppose, primarily aimed at India, and I trust that you will put it there forcefully. You referred to Pakistan's counter-terrorism operation in CISS-IISS and called for its extension. Pakistan has never said that it will not extend this operation to all areas of Pakistan. But you must recognize that Pakistan is defending two borders, on the east and on the west. The army is also involved in countering internal insurgency. Then the army has limited manpower. So it has to move in stages. And it has declared that it will move in stages against every terrorist of every denomination and every color. So let's hope that this suggestion, I can tell you that this suggestion is already accepted in Pakistan, but let's hope that it will be implemented very soon as well. Your second proposal was that India should reiterate that Kashmir is still a problem to be settled and should express its determination or willingness for a dialogue. I think there can be no two questions about that in Pakistan. Certainly we believe that Kashmir is an issue that remains to be settled in accordance with the wishes of the Kashmiri people. And if India comes to a similar conclusion, nothing like it. And your last proposal was a back channel between the two countries, perhaps between the intelligence agencies. I thought that the NSAs were in contact at one time of both countries. Ajit Doval and General Janjua had spoken to each other on the telephone a number of times. They had met also once in Thailand. And I certainly feel that they can continue that conversation. There is no limit from our side on continuing conversations between the NSAs of the two countries. The back channel experience of Pakistan is mixed. Some people say that it was a good initiative, it should have continued. Others believe very vehemently that back channels do not work. So if there is another effort at a back channel, perhaps the problem with the back channel, the only problem with the back channel is that you do not involve policymakers in that. One person is making all the decisions. Certainly in the case of President Musharraf, it was only, according to Mr. Kasuri himself, 5 people who knew in Pakistan what was going on in the back channel. And I suspect that even amongst those 5, only 2 or 3 knew the full extent of the back channel. So I don't know whether a back channel can work between India and Pakistan or not. But an effort certainly can be made, if not at a back channel officially between the two countries, but in the track 2 dialogue or a track 1.5 dialogue. Even that is being closed out. As has been pointed out here, the societal contacts between India and Pakistan are also being terminated. There was a move in India not to allow any Pakistani artists to work in India. Then there was a counter move in Pakistan not to allow Indian movies to be shown in Pakistan. I think we have to get over this mindset. And unless both sides get over this mindset, progress will not be made, because if one side continues to enforce such measures, the other side will be forced to take similar actions by their own population. So it's a difficult problem. I wish you success. Your 8 proposals are acceptable to Pakistan. I trust that you can persuade India to accept the same. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank all the speakers and the session chairs. We will have a break for lunch now. All participants are requested to reassemble at 2:30 for the next session to proceed. Shiri Mazari, Mr. Antoine Levis, and Dr. Naeem Salik are also requested to take their positions on the panel. Mr. Khalid Banoori is the Director General for Arms Control and Disarmament Affairs at Pakistan's Strategic Plans Division, where he was appointed in November 2005. His earlier association with the SPD as Deputy Director and later as Additional Director has been from the year of organization's inception in August 2000. He is a fighter pilot by training and served in the Pakistan Air Force from 1979 till his retirement. Mr. Banoori holds an MSc in Defense and Strategic Studies from Quaid-e-Azam University, Islamabad, and an MA in Defense Studies from King's College, London. He is a former fellow of the Henry L. Stimson Center, Washington, D.C. He is decorated with Sitara-e-Imtiaz, both civilian and military, for his outstanding commitment and devotion to service. I now give the floor to Mr. Khalid Banoori for proceeding with the session.
Thank you. You can relax now. Ladies and gentlemen, we have an important session now. It's about doctrine and deterrence and the various aspects of it. Let's start right away. The first speaker here is Mr. Desmond Bowman, who is a IISS member, a former Director General from the Ministry of Defence, UK. He's a career civil servant from 1973 to 2008, many years of experience, specializing in the field of defence and security. He was part of the UK's negotiating delegation, which concluded the Convention Forces in Europe, the CFE, treaty in 1990. So just the right person to talk to us about this. He was the deputy head of the Cabinet Office Secretariat, now called the National Security Secretariat in the UK, from 2002 to 4, and a Director General for Security Policy in the MOD from 4 to 8, with responsibility for nuclear deterrence policy. And Mr. Roy will be talking to us in the context of deterrence and Doctrine and Deterrence about the nuclearization and land, sea and air. You have the floor, sir.
Well, thank you very much, and welcome back after lunch. The topic that I had was nuclearization on land, in the air, and at sea. And I think that's contracted just to doctrine and deterrence in the program. This is clearly a vast a topic of vast scope. And my focus is to consider the link between doctrine and deterrence, and to ask what it is that makes deterrence credible. Now, I intend to start with concerns which policymakers in the West have had to confront in recent years in interpreting both the policy and behavior of Russia. The Western deterrence policy, as set out in the US Nuclear Posture Review of 2010 and the UK's White Paper of 2006, that policy has been to reduce the salience of nuclear weapons in international relations and in its defense posture. The likelihood of recourse to nuclear weapons is considered to be remote and only in defense of vital national interests. Although some analysts have toyed with the idea of nuclear weapons being considered for use only in the context of a nuclear threat by an opponent, and the term used is sole use, or have indicated interest in a Declaration of No First Use, NFU. Neither of these concepts have been taken up by policymakers for reasons which to me seem self-evident. We can return to that later if you want to. Now, a reading of Russian military doctrine, and the last statement was in December 2014, would lead one to believe that there was broad equivalence in the approach, down to a reference to responding to an existential threat. But the rhetoric and military exercise practice of the Russian authorities more recently has given rise to real concern about a willingness to use nuclear weapons to defend what is now called historic territory, and this is a term used by President Putin immediately after the annexation of Crimea, but a willingness also to use weapons to target elements of the evolving NATO architecture to create ballistic missile defenses against Iranian missiles in Romania, Poland, and in Denmark, and to consider the use of nuclear weapons for limited regional purposes, including something called de-escalation. Now, NATO's response has not been to increase the salience of its nuclear capability, but to reaffirm its existing doctrine. And paragraph 54 of the Warsaw Summit of 2016 is the key passage in which NATO sets out its position in declaratory mode. And it highlights two, what I think are valuable principles. The first is that any use of nuclear weapons would fundamentally alter the nature of a conflict. In other words, nuclear use at a small scale, limited and at limited range, for tactical gain, could not be undertaken with impunity. The taboo would have been breached and unknowable consequences would follow. The second principle is that if the fundamental security of NATO's members were to be threatened, NATO has the means and resolve to impose unacceptable costs on an adversary. It's noteworthy, I think, that the manner of inflicting those costs is left unspecified. It could be conventional or nuclear, even non-military, local or countrywide. And note also that the broad deterrent doctrine applies when fundamental security is at stake. Ambiguity is maintained in this message, but the message, I think, is clear in the determination to preserve peace, prevent coercion, and deter aggression. Brinkmanship is not a safe option in such circumstances. Now, I cannot tell you whether the message is effective, whether deterrence is working, because only what goes on in the mind of the potential adversary is what counts ultimately. But what is clear is that the intent of the summiteers at Warsaw was very clearly set out, and it is striving to make NATO's deterrent message credible. Now, does this have any relevance to South Asia? Not in terms of direct analogy, but perhaps I am suggesting in terms of asking what makes deterrence work in practice. Now, my understanding is that both parties in South Asia claim to have a second strike capability. The sense is that a preemptive strike could not be a knockout blow, disabling any nuclear response by either side, and that any, for example, ABM shield would be ineffective. That, I think, is an important understanding, although strategists will always strive for dominance, and technology may seem to offer opportunities for that. For nuclear stability, it is better that no such risk-taking is deemed worthwhile by either leadership. A measure of stability derives from ruling out a bolt from the blue. There is simplicity and strength in the notion of deterrence by punishment. That is to say, that unacceptable damage in relation to the intended gain could be inflicted by an aggressor whose actions threaten vital interests. Now, that simplicity is complicated by adding capacity to enable deterrence by denial. Now, my understanding is that denial can be conceived as a counterforce tool to eliminate the opponent's equivalent means of aggression, or as a way of frustrating the opponent's achievement of battlefield success. Now, both of these ideas in terms of counterforce capability, both of these ideas had currency at early stages of the Cold War confrontation, but lost their luster for reasons of impracticality, cost, and because they implied a war-making use for nuclear weapons completely out of kilter with their devastating potential and the likelihood of uncontrolled escalation. Now, both India and Pakistan have the potential for counterforce operations, given good intelligence, sufficient precision, and enough launchers to cover the targets. Both also have the means to deliver substrategic nuclear payloads, in that they have adaptable or dedicated shorter-range delivery capability. I understand that India's basic policy is one of punishment by massive retaliation.